So hey, here we are on the dyno. We're gonna see what it can do. So we're gonna do a couple runs. Obviously we wanna see max power, max torque. The stock Tesla control limits the base drive unit to a little over 14,000 RPM. That's about 115 miles an hour when we tested it. The sport unit would run up to a little over 15,000. As far as we understand, the ludicrous drive units can actually go to 18,000 RPM, which is 155 miles an hour. So what's cool about the AEM control board is that any concept of some kind of early rev limiter has been completely removed. Any of those, once they're running with an AEM control board, can run full speed, full power, all the way to 18,000 RPM. No rev limiters, all that's completely removed. But I will say, at 18,000, they're not exactly making a lot of power. So for the dyno pulls, we're gonna run up to about 13,000 RPM. It's around 100 miles an hour. That's plenty fast for the dyno. It definitely gives us a good opportunity to show the max torque that we're gonna make down low. We're also gonna exercise a couple of different power levels, performance levels with the keypad. So on tap, with one button push, I can go from 300 Newton meters of torque up to 400. I think we're ready to go. Let's let her rip. All right, so we did our max power, all the beans, big number runs, and now just to kind of demonstrate what the performance levels will do, we're gonna switch down to performance level 2. So I'm gonna hit that button. Okay, performance level 1, all the beans, 450 Newton meters. And performance level 2, 400 Newton meters. All right, now we're gonna go performance level 3, take it down another notch. Torque limit, 350 Newton meters. So we let it ready for power level 4. This is grandma mode. No offense to any grandmas. Maybe we'll call it turtle mode. No offense to any turtles. And that's about it. I'll tell you what, as a tuner, I really appreciate how clean and quiet being in this car is. I used to tune race cars and all kinds of stuff, and I would just stink like exhaust and get headaches and just be nauseous all the time. EV tuning is like worlds better than old ICE tuning, I'll tell you that. And my ears appreciate it too. It's quite a bit quieter. The Tesla drive unit has a 9.73 to 1 reduction gear ratio, so almost a factor of 10. So we're making 460 Newton meters of torque at the rotor, times 10 is like 4,600 Newton meters of axle torque that you're measuring at the wheel. All right, so performance level 1, max power, all the beans, foot to the floor, as fast as we can go. We're making a very consistent 460 Newton meters of torque out to about 5,500 RPM. At this point, this is called your field weakening point. So in order to maintain and make as much power as we can, we have to start dropping the torque curve off. So the torque curve is starting to decrease. Our power curve, we're making right at just a tad under 300 kilowatts of horsepower, plenty of go. So performance level 2, so we're asking for 450, we get about 460, not bad. We're gonna drop it down about 50 Newton meters, not quite, 424, 425. It's nice when you get more than you ask for. Next performance level, we're gonna drop it down to 350, which is getting us more like 380, still not a bad problem to have. And then finally, our last performance level, down to 300, our valet mode. And actually this is user configurable. You can tune it to however you want. You can do even bigger steps. You can go 100 Newton meter, 200, 300, 400, whatever you want. Point being is you've got the functionality and the ability to do such a thing when a lot of other systems don't give you that capability whatsoever. So as Sound Guy just mentioned, he's looked at these torque curves and noticed that while the torque curves are actually decreasing, and they are, the peak power down here at about 9,000 RPM actually stays the same. So they all wind up making the same amount of power because in the way the electric motor trades off torque for power, they eventually cross at about 9,000. We might be decreasing our lower RPM torque and acceleration, but our peak power actually winds up being the same. So kind of an interesting tidbit of information there. So AEM EV would be totally remiss if we didn't really spell out the full truth and everything that goes into a performance electric motor and an inverter. So we've taken the time to strip out all the limitations and D-rates and things that make the Tesla drive unit limited in its performance. We've taken a lot away and we've fully unleashed it to its max possible power output, best we can do. That's one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is the battery. When we run these motors and these drive units, you're not making a complete or fair comparison without at least acknowledging what kind of battery you're using. We touched briefly on the fact that the car actually has batteries out of a hybrid minivan. Another common battery that someone might choose to use is the battery out of a Model S itself. The battery type in a full electric vehicle versus a hybrid, they're actually quite a bit different. The hybrid battery is designed to drop a lot of current, move a lot of current and a lot of power very quickly, whereas an electric vehicle that's got a battery is more designed to provide a steady or more consistent power flow and not necessarily give you a big power punch. Our car has hybrid batteries. They like to deliver a lot of current and a lot of power very quickly, so we are able to make a lot of power with our base drive unit. We've run a Model S P85 car on this dyno before. While you do get nearly 600 newton meters of torque, the torque curve very quickly drops off. And the reason being is that the battery just doesn't have the power and performance to really push that power curve out as long and as far as it can. So what we discovered was that our base unit, combined with these hybrid batteries, actually makes more power than a Model S P85 Plus, which blows our minds. It's wild. But anyway, so let's take a look at the numbers and kind of show what that looks like. So the blue curve is a Tesla Model S P85 Plus. You'll see that the torque curve peaks just under 600 newton meters, but pretty quickly starts dropping off. These other two torque curves here, those are from our base unit using the AEM EV inverter control board. And you'll notice they have two slightly different trends. First trace is our green trace, and that is actually our I'll say our dyno development equipment that we have. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to show. It's kind of top secret stuff, so we've kind of kept that stashed away. But anyways, with that drive unit and with our power supply that we supply and provide the power with to that drive unit on our dyno, we're able to make quite a bit of power. It really pushes the power curve and the field weakening point out quite a bit. The red curve represents the car and what torque and power we're able to make with it and its battery. So you'll notice that we still make the same peak torque. That's all based on current. But what happens is as the battery starts to kind of drop off when how much power it can supply, the field weakening point starts to happen a little sooner. As the torque curve drops off, it is actually dropping below the torque curve of our base unit. Our base unit with our hybrid batteries makes significantly more power. So while the Tesla will give you a good kick in the pants right off the line, the torque curve, all the fun is dropping off right away. It's just slowing down, slowing down, slowing down. What this tells you is that you're not quite limited in the drive unit itself. A lot of people push right towards a performance drive unit, but if you've got the battery behind it to really give it the current and the power it needs, you get a shocking amount of power out of a base unit. As you're planning your EV build, take serious consideration into your battery. Hybrid batteries work great. They're good at making a lot of power. EV batteries, depending on what your goals are, if something like longer life is more important to you, then perhaps an EV battery is in your future. We're a little more performance minded. We want to make that big number, so we go with hybrid batteries. Next step for us, we're going to get some more cars in here, put them on the dyno, see what kind of numbers they put down, and then the final step is to take them to the drag strip and run them down the quarter mile.
Hey, how you doing? My name's Justin. I got a 2008 Ford Mustang Bullitt. It's got about 73,000 miles on it. Pretty much came from the factory just like this with 315 horsepower. Has a factory Ford Performance cold air intake, only came in the 5-speed. I've left it completely stock minus a recent muffler delete, and then I put some KW coilovers on it. I do have a little bit of a background with EV. I helped on the build of the Mill Blackbird, which is a CG car that they use in film production, mostly for commercials, where we can basically make the car any car we want just by changing the wheels, setting the wheelbase, setting the track width, and then they CG a body onto it, and it's an EV car. Oh, it's gonna most likely get its ass kicked.
we've run the Mustang GT, the Bullitt car on the dyno. So the first thing you'll notice in the dyno plots is that the RPM range for the Mustang is from about 1,500 RPM to a little over 6,000 RPM. At that point, you got to shift into the next higher gear and keep going. With the Tesla, it'll run up to nearly 18,000 RPM. So our range is quite a bit larger. So there's no shifts that have to occur. There's no upshifting, no clutch, no delays between gear shifts. It's all just right there, right away, pedal down and go. The power pulls on something like a Tesla will go from basically stopped all the way to well over 100 plus miles an hour. We ran it maybe up to like 75 miles an hour in third gear. So we're able to measure the power in each gear independently. So we didn't have to run it in fourth gear direct drive. We can run it in actually any gear, synchronize the speed and run it in that particular gear, which works out really well. Let's get down to the nitty gritty and actually talk about some of the number details here. This particular motor is what's called the mod motor 4.6 3-valve, and the 3-valve has the benefit of having a single overhead cam that actually is variable, and you can see where that variable cam kicks in, and you can see that in the torque curve. Down here we're making let's say 330-ish Newton meters of torque, and then it looks like the cams probably start to do their thing, and it makes a peak of about 385 Newton meters. That's pretty good. That's not bad at all. And that carries out and drops off to about 325 once we get to the red line of about 6,200 RPM. Now, as far as what that equates to in power, we're making just a little over 210 kilowatts, 209, 210 kilowatts. Pretty good, considering the motor is rated for 315, figuring in about a 15% drivetrain loss. These numbers totally make sense for what they are. Now, the thing to compare really is just the stark comparison between the power level you get with the internal combustion engine and then what you would get with something like the Tesla. Another 100 kilowatts basically of power. And I think every 100 kilowatts is 1.3, so about another 135 horsepower. The performance on an EV, on something like a Tesla large drive unit is bar none. Gear reduction ratios you get, the torque output, I mean, it's a big honking motor and a big drive unit that just makes a ton of torque and has a single gear that revs all the way to almost 18,000 RPM. So it's just, there's no comparison. They're night and day different, and you can see that in the dyno plot. The next car up that we're gonna run is actually, we're gonna pit the Tesla powered, Tesla battery, Tesla Sport drive unit from a Model S P car to our Mustang. We've just finished running the Model S P85 Plus car, and this has got rear-wheel drive, two-wheel drive only, large drive unit, sport version, the performance version. Right off the bat, let's look at the torque curve. So large drive unit has been published to make about 600 Newton meters of rotor torque. We'll be generous and give the peak. It made about 570, 571 Newton meters of torque. That's great, that's really good. And actually driving this car around, I mean, it throws you in this seat. It really is instantaneous, it's awesome. But the thing we wanna see, you know, granted it does make 550, 570 plus Newton meters of torque. You can't ignore the trend, the actual torque trend itself, the characteristic of the torque curve, that it pretty quickly starts to drop off. You get that really first quick acceleration, and then you kind of feel that the fun is starting to end, and it kind of doesn't pull as hard as long. So the torque curve drops off and continues to drop off, and what that really is indicative of is the battery chemistry. You do get the kick in the pants right off the bat, that's great, but the power, just because your bottleneck, the limit here actually is the battery itself. It's not able to push out the power and the current that the motor really needs to continue making as much power as possible. So that was the torque curve. Let's look at the power curve. And here we can start to kind of compare to the power curve from the Testang. Because the sport unit is making more torque, the upward trend of the power curve is greater than the one on the Testang. It's with the base LDU. So it's making more power, making it a little more sooner because it's making so much more torque. It's making like 150 Newton meters more torque, which is very significant. But because the torque curve is starting to fall off, the power curve peaks, that's probably about 40 miles an hour like I was saying before, and it pretty well flat lines and then kind of starts to drop off as the motor speed continues to increase. So the thing to really take away from this, let's look at the power curve from the Testang with our base LDU with the AEM EV control board. Is granted, our rate of power isn't as significant or as high as it is in the sport unit, but notice that it keeps going and it finally peaks up right at 300 kilowatts. According to our dyno, this Tesla Model S P85 Plus made about 275 kilowatts of power. We're making 25 kilowatts of power more with the base large drive unit in our Testang. That's pretty cool. And the meat and potatoes of that power curve is right here. You can see that the Tesla torque curve is trending down, and the Testang with our AEM EV control board is not at all trending down as much as the Tesla curve is. So this is torque that's continually being delivered at a higher rate as the motor continues to still accelerate. The power curve is not dropping off, the car is not slowing down, the car is accelerating. You're gonna see these results very dramatically, I think, in the quarter mile. My expectation is the car probably will get us in the first, I don't know, a couple hundred feet. And then where this power curve continues to increase past the Tesla's power curve, that the Testang is probably gonna start catching up and possibly walking away from the Model S on the quarter mile. If you're out there and you're doing research and looking around and wondering what kind of battery you should pick, this data really does kind of point you towards something like a hybrid battery, whereas something like that full electric battery, it serves a purpose that may not necessarily be as well suited for maximum performance. So we know that best case scenario, our control board on a base drive unit makes 50 to 55 more newton meters of torque than a stock setup does. Stock Tesla is going to be probably down here at the 400 mark, and if we project that out, it's going to follow, I'm assuming, the same trend where it's going to want to start falling off and kind of mirror the P85 power curve or the torque curve. It's going to be somewhere down underneath here and quite a bit less power, probably under 250 kilowatts. If it makes more than 250, I'll be surprised. All right, hey guys, so a little bit of a bonus footage here. Let me give you a little background, a little premise about what we're doing right now and why we're doing it. So when we did all of the base LDU development, what we tested and did development on was actually a stripped down drive unit that was mounted in a Tesla subframe, had the drivetrain suspension, the axles, the wheels, hubs, everything, and that whole assembly minus a car, we made a rig for and we bolted it to our dyno, and that's where we did literally well over 1,000 runs to collect data and characterize and tune the motor. A lot of this base data that we have were from that test unit. The one thing we haven't done is actually tested a true, real, from the factory base Model S base drive unit. So it's exactly what we've been testing all along, but we're gonna leave it paired with its stock Tesla battery. We want to see, like, let's do a true apples to apples comparison. That's what we're doing today. We're going to lay down these numbers, do a quick analysis, and do a final comparison to really show the difference you're going to see between these drive units with our control, stock control, as well as how important the battery really plays a part in what kind of power you're going to get out of your drive unit. Let's do some pulls and see what kind of numbers we do. So now that we're looking at the data, pretty sure I said we're going to make 250, and it turns out that peak power, this is the red trace here on the base unit on this car, made 247 kilowatts. So right around that 250 mark. 420 newton meters of torque. We've seen that before. That's pretty standard. And just like we saw in the P85 car, is it makes that torque, but it can only make it for so long. Honestly, before the battery power and its voltage really starts to drop off. Thus, when that happens, you see that the torque curve starts dropping off, and that correlates into the power curve coming up, broadening out at about 250 kilowatts and then staying relatively flat, and then eventually tapering off in high RPM. So the next step up from this, let's talk about getting into the AEM control board. Okay, we put that into the drive unit, and now the drive unit is completely unleashed. Comparing to the next combination, which is going to be the base drive unit, AEM control board, and the hybrid batteries in our Testang, we've got our green trace. So looking at the green trace, in this particular setup, we're making about plus 40 newton meters of torque. And if you look at it, we carry this gap. We basically mirror the torque curve from factory, bump it up, and carry that gap all the way through, all the way up to real high RPM. And what that translates into in the power curve is you see that it sweeps up and then it more gradually lays over, and we're making plus 50 kilowatts more power. We're making about 300 kilowatts of power, when on the base unit, it peaked at about 250 kilowatts. So plus 50 kilowatts of power. That's a pretty substantial power increase. So that's what the Testang gives you. When you've got a good battery with good current and power capacity that can dump a lot of current quickly, those power cells, we're going to put them to good use. We're able to make 300 kilowatts of power with the Testang, and we're able to bump that up to like 335-ish kilowatts of power when we've got our Dyno battery stack, our big power supply for the Dyno. And the reason we're making that additional power is basically what we're doing. We're not making any additional torque. The torque is based on current. What we're able to do is actually keep making that torque longer. By pushing out the torque curve and not dropping it off until a higher RPM, that results in a higher power curve. And then compared to the Tesla, the gain is huge. It's almost 90 kilowatts, almost another 100 kilowatts in going from something like the Tesla package with the Tesla battery to like best case scenario. If you had a really badass battery that could do a lot of power and a lot of current, you technically could hit this. Stock's not bad. There's the AEM. AEM is better, and the AEM with the best battery you can imagine is better yet. All right, so the next step for us, we're done on the dyno. We're gonna get everything gathered up, head up to Bakersfield, hit the quarter mile. Stay tuned, and we'll see how we do.